Well, welcome everyone to today's session of the Berlin Climate and Security Conference. My name is Susanne Schmeier. I work for IHE Delft, one of the partners of the Water, Peace and Security Partnership, and I have the honor to be your moderator today. In this session today, we'll take a look at how we can actually move to action when it comes to climate and water security. So we know actually, and you've probably seen this in previous sessions of the conference already, that we do have quite a vast knowledge on the linkages between climate change, water insecurity, and other risks on the one hand, and the conflict risks that are related to those on the other hand. We have research on this, we have quite a bit of policy experience on this at various levels, from the UN all the way down to the local level. But there seems still a bit of a gap between, on the one hand, from a more academic perspective, understanding these linkages between water, climate, and security risks, and then on the other hand, actually deriving actionable policy recommendations from this. So what we want to do in the session today is look at how we can bring the two sides together. How can we use tools and analysis that help us to understand water and climate-related conflicts to actually trigger action and to equip policymakers, decision makers at various governance levels with the tools and the knowledge that they might need in order to, well, ideally prevent conflicts, but possibly at least mitigate them. The session is organized by the Water, Peace and Security Partnership. It's a partnership that brings together a number of organizations on the research, but also on the NGO side, that together work on, as the name obviously says, water, peace and security. This is IHE Delft, Deltares, the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, the World Resources Institute, Wetlands International, International Alert, but also closely collaborating with our associate partners from Oregon State University, from Klingendal, and also collaborating with Adelphi, our generous hosts today. I don't want to take more of your time, but actually get to all of our interesting speakers. Let me just mention that we are very keen on hearing your feedbacks, getting your questions, so please use either the Q&A or the chat function here in Zoom. I will be monitoring them, so we'll come back to your questions later. But let's get started. So as I was saying, we want to look at how knowledge, tools, data analysis that are out there can actually be used to make a difference when addressing water and climate conflicts at the global and at the more local level. And we have speakers from the global and the local level. And let's start at the global. I'm very happy that we have Christopher Hodder here today. He is the Climate Security Advisor for the UN Assistance Mission in Somalia. And we're very happy to have you here with us, Chris, today. And we'd be curious to hear a bit from you. Where do you see the challenges when it comes to water, climate, and security? Maybe with reference to Somalia, but also the more global level. And what do you think is needed to actually translate what we know from a data and knowledge perspective to policy action? Chris, please.
Brilliant, thanks, Suzanne, and hi, everybody. As I said, my name is Chris Hodder. I'm the Climate Security and Environmental Advisor to Somalia. I think that from a global perspective, we know now, as you were saying, the links between climate and conflict and the water aspects. And what we're seeing in countries like where I'm working in terms of Somalia is this real clearer link between climate change and the competition over the resources in Somalia, specifically over water. And when we look at Somalia, we're definitely seeing this extremities of water, from drought to flooding. And so what we're trying to see is actually, climate change is exacerbating those pathways between climate and conflict. And what we're seeing is then that those pathways are actually contributing to the increase or the changes in the dynamic of conflict at the community level. And so I won't go too much into that, because I think a lot of people have discussed, and we've seen a lot of those linkages and those pathways. So today it's much more around what are the challenges and what are the things we're seeing. So I think that we're definitely seeing in Somalia anyway, and I think globally, more of this need of data and information. And I think that trying to look at data from the point of view of the gaps in terms of these pathways is really key. And so, things like the GPS data, the satellite imagery, looking at really, trying to then go even further into understanding some of the community dynamics and the conflicts around those natural resources, the change in land usage, the degradation issues, and so deforestation, all these sort of changes and aspects, and how can we get more of that information? So I definitely think there's more data that needs to come out, but the challenge is then how do you collect data in a insecure environment is a real big complexity, and so we need to have the ability to really collect that data at that local level, and even things like soil health, looking at, so we're looking at Somalia, things like riverbanks, and how do we look at breakages, how do we look at changes in river levels that's going to happen from climate change. And we know that precipitation levels are changing over the years, and we know the projection is that it's increasing. So how do we look at that local level? But again, the challenge then is, governments and who are already stretched in terms of resources, and then how do you have the ability for those governments that are under large amounts of stress to be able to coordinate and deal with that data? So it's not just the provision of the data, it's also how do you build that into a very fragile system. So I think that's a really complicated part of that. But I think that there's, in terms of policy, there's definitely a political will in countries, and I think there's a recognition of this conflict and climate issue, and there's a growing really drive, and IGAD from the regional perspective, I think the AU from across the continent perspective are really taking this forward as a key perspective. But the question is that how do you make that political will and harness that political will to really focus at the local level, specifically in a resource in a fragile state situations. So I think that there's a complexity there about supporting the political will at the central level and trying to build the capacity of the system, versus what is actually also very much needed is the local adaptation at the community level. And so I think that the policy side has to deal with both the top level and the community level. And I think that really this locally led adaptation, looking at rewilding, reforestation, looking at water catchment at that local level, using indigenous knowledge, really trying to work with local communities at that local level is the absolute key. But the question around that is how do you build that in a sort of environment where you need to also have a central system. So central system versus remote and locally led adaptation is quite a policy level complexities there. But I think that also the last point I wanted to make is around the fact that we need to bring together humanitarian development and peace actors. So we can't do this as a sort of siloed approach. This has to be a cross-cutting approach to water and natural resource governance. And so, for example, in Somalia, what we're trying to do is bring together at that local level. So when we've got river banks, we've got something like 300 breakages along the river that we're trying to fix using local adaptation methods. But we're trying to bring together humanitarian actors that can fix those breakages, but then think around those breakages, how do we bring medium-term and longer-term solutions with those humanitarian responses so that we can have a sort of thinking around, okay, the river's going to rise, these breakages are going to happen, how do we bring that all together? And then finally, bringing the peace actors together. So how do we think, like, for example, actors, militant groups that are breaking riverbanks and are using climate change also as a control mechanism, how do we bring those into the point of this whole approach to bring a coordinated nexus approach to that sort of side of things? So yeah, I'll stop there, but that's the sort of three areas I was thinking about.
Thanks a lot, Chris. That's indeed a really good input. And I think your emphasis on involving the local level and making sure that actually action happens at the local level, but is connected to what happens at higher levels, be they national level or actually the global community with the support that, for example, the UN is providing, is crucial, and is actually also a perfect segue to our second speaker. We have Ikal Anglai with us today. She is the co-founder and also the director of Friends of Lake Turkana. And as you probably, or most of you know, Lake Turkana is also a region that has been and is still facing its share of climate and water security risks, not least with the current drought in Kenya. So we're very curious to hear from you, Ikal. What's the situation in Lake Turkana now? And what would you, from your perspective, someone really working on the ground on the topic, what would you need or what would you expect in terms of data, tools, analysis that could help you to make a difference?
Thanks, Suzanne. Thanks, Chris, for sort of, as you were speaking, I kept thinking to myself, why am I on this panel? He's kind of touched on everything. But yeah, I mean, it's similar, it's similar geographies that we are working in. So for those who don't know, Lake Turkana, the Lake Turkana region has the largest desert lake. And so that itself is a miracle. In a very dry area, you have this lake, which has no outlet, but has an inlet that is shared with Ethiopia. I think just responding to the question, one, we have we have a really bad drought. So what we usually get rains, short rains, and this year we got 2 days of rain. What ideally should be about a week and a half to 2 weeks of rain we've not had it. And again, it's building on a previous drought. So we've just had little short rains that are just not allowing for the pasture to regenerate, and it is very crazy. But you see, when everyone talks about the drought, they look at the food for the animals. They don't look at the water concept. And in most cases, you can find in certain parts, not everywhere, but certain parts of the region, there is some browsing pasture, but there is absolutely no water. If you look at the quality of the livestock, most livestock die from lack of water than from lack of pasture. And so when everybody's focusing on the drought, it is, let's buy feed for the animals, but no one's looking at the water solution. I actually have livestock myself, and I think my livestock are surviving because I have the ability to purchase some water and track it for the animals, something that not many people have. So just looking at it from that scenario, the focus when everyone talks about drought, they look at food, but not water. And you see a little bit of effort, by governments will actually, if you look at all the news reports, it's governments talking about food relief, not water relief, not water points. And so that's the biggest struggle that we're seeing here. But when you also look at the support that is needed, as you know, Lake Turkana is basically supported by a transboundary, a shared river with Ethiopia, and developments happening, transboundary developments. And we all have all this international treaties on transboundary waters. But sadly, they are just treaties that there's very little follow-up on. So development plans by Ethiopia, the same thing that's happening with the Nile, some of those issues, and we've seen it across, it's a global issue, whether it is Mexico and the US, whether it is Canada and the US, whether it is Turkey, the Tigris, you see the struggle around transboundary water resources that we are seeing here, that there is just no mechanism, no body that is able to bring, conversations around it. And the current Nile scenario between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt is being handled in the US, not locally. So you find all this very parachuting, syndrome where we are looking for solutions elsewhere. Again, the geopolitics comes into play. But then the realities is the struggle, the impacts are not being discussed in terms of the local communities. The discussion, the current scenario between Kenya and Ethiopia is being discussed in the UNEP. And UNEP is doing all these papers that really don't take into account the issues and the conversations on the ground. So when you're talking about research, when you're talking about it, Suzanne, earlier around academia, we've got to start thinking about participatory research, where the people themselves are part of the research, they're contributing to the research, they're bringing in lived experiences, and they're bringing in traditional knowledge, as Christopher talked about it. That if the research comes in from a very extractive model of knowledge production, then we start to have a very skewed conclusion that doesn't really appreciate those lived realities. And I think that's very important to bring in. And then if you look at the discussion around water development, it always looks at borehole drilling. So it's not when the conversation about water development happens, it's always about how do I drill water to give water, but not looking at the ecosystem of the water, where it's coming from, how it is used, how it is conserved, who is deciding where it is being drilled. And for a pastoralist population, you find people will say, don't drill a borehole here because it means that you bring more pressure on the land use, as Christoph was talking about land use. So if you create a water point, schools come, villages come, hospitals come, and you change the land use. And so you put pressure on a particular area that changes the way people access and use their lands and rangelands. I think it's important to look at water development beyond the drilling of boreholes, beyond the infrastructure, and really look at, we need to expand the meaning of water development to really look at conservation, in terms of, instead of water conservation on its own, infrastructure on its own, water development has got to be very encompassing, so that it really talks from the research to really inform how we use the water, who is deciding, when is it being decided, and all that. So that's something that we feel that needs to be brought out here. But when you look at the conflict around it, because it's not only the decisions of where the water is drilled that brings conflict, but how it is used. So again, as I said, when you change now, you make everybody come there and they're thinking, oh, it's our water project. But in actual sense, it then creates some exclusion and say, no, it's ours, not yours. And so those very local conflicts are really critical to look at. And again, as Chris was talking about it, big policy discussions right now, sadly, whether we like it or not, when you talk about water, you cannot delink water from food security and energy. And so our conversations around conflicts is that how water is used for energy production, and how that means that downstream somebody is suffering, such is the case that the Gibe 3 dams is happening with Ethiopia and the Nile. And so the conflicts around that, you're also seeing it with farming inputs, where big agro-business is taking up the water, and downstream, what happens to the local, small scale producers and how they can use the water. So a lot of within the Turkana region, a lot of the people are usually looking at, shallow dams, shallow wells that you dig on the riverbeds, and how, large dams that are built, whether it's boreholes, which are built along the river, actually obstruct the water. That means that somebody downstream who uses their, little something small to dig at the riverbeds cannot get water. And that's why that ecosystem approach to water research has got to happen. So right now it's very siloed. I think we need to really expand it to an ecosystem approach of development, research, and participation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ikal. I think these were so many important points. I'll not try to recapture those, but I think they're all extremely valid. So let me just think where we take it from here. I think one of your key messages was that it is important, well, not only to, what we typically say, involve local communities, but to actually make sure that whatever change is needed comes from the local communities, because they actually know, as you were saying, what's happening on the ground, what are maybe indirect, unintended or intended indirect effects of certain action, and also what's needed and what is acceptable in the region, not only from, as you say, a water management perspective, but also everything that happens behind that, be it other sectors, the influence of agriculture and energy, or be it social dynamics, ethnic dynamics, whatever might be behind it in different regions. Let's have a look at the more research or academic side, or more specifically, what we at the Water, Peace and Security Partnership are actually trying in order to provide decision makers at the various governance levels with tools, with an understanding of how to work in terms of prevent or mitigate water conflicts, because then we've presented both sides and hopefully can engage in a discussion with all of you. I again encourage you to put your questions or comments or thoughts in the Q&A of how we can move this ahead, how we can move from understanding to action. And for that, I would like to hand over to Karen Meyer. Karen Meyer from Deltares, a specialist on water, climate, and the social impacts of water and climate-related risks, is also the person who, in the Water, Peace and Security Partnership, pilots and leads our local analytical work. So Karen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Susanne, and thank you also to Chris and Ikal for elaborating all the complexities that are there in reality when you want to address those linkages between water and security. And like Susanne already mentioned, what we are trying to do with the Water, Peace and Security project is it's not a research project, so we're not trying to generate new data. We do so to some extent, but the main thing that we're trying to do is to make the data and information that is already there accessible to really support action and to make sure that information is understood by those taking decisions. So in that way, we hope to contribute to better informed actions. So what I would like to do in those 10 minutes, maybe a little bit less, is to give you an overview of how we do that in our water, peace and security approach that we are continuously still further developing, actually, based on the experience that we get in the regions in which we work. How do I get to the next slide? Yeah, so we call it the water, peace and security integrated approach. And with integrated, we mean both an integration of knowledge from different domains. So we're integrating methods and knowledge on water management with knowledge on how to do conflict resolution or peace building, and how to understand how situations escalate into violence. But with integration, we also mean an integration of data and science in policy and practice, so to make sure that the information can be used to take better informed actions. And we do this through a joint water security analysis with the stakeholders from multiple sectors, from multiple levels as well, actually, to work with them to share an understanding of how water and security are linked, because we think if we share that understanding, and with people from different sectors, they may understand a part of the system, like the water system, really well, but they don't know how it links to conflict, or the other way around. So we think it's very important that those acting on water insecurity jointly analyze how water insecurity are linked, so that they can also identify possible actions to reduce these risks. And we, as a Water, Peace and Security Consortium, then try to support those discussions with quantitative data from models and other sources of information. And we make this information available through interactive and easy to understand dashboards, so to make sure that those involved in the discussions can actually use that information to have more in-depth discussions and also see the extent of the problems and the effectiveness of proposed solutions. So we're trying to combine all of these in a co-creation approach or process that is not a workshop where we present results from an analysis one time, but where we have a series of meetings that we alternate with analysis, so that each meeting can build on the previous meeting, but also on additional information that is collected or generated in between the meetings. And we think that this approach in itself is hopefully contributing to capacity development, but where needed, we also identify specific gaps for which we provide dedicated trainings. And we're currently working on this in Mali, Niger, Chad, Iraq, Kenya, and Ethiopia. But in this presentation, I would like to show you some examples of the work that we've done in Mali so far. So in, I say Mali, but we're actually talking about a part in central Mali, which is called the Inner Niger Delta, which you see here in the center, which is an area of 15 to 20,000 square kilometers that is inundated annually, but also falls dry again. And that provides the ecosystem services on which around 2 million people base their livelihood. So there are people who are farming, there are fishermen, there are pastoralists. And that area, there's already a lot of violence in that area between those communities and within communities. And especially since 2018, this has become worse. And the fear is that if upstream more water is abstracted for an irrigation area managed by Office du Niger, or a new dam is built upstream of Mali in Guinea, that would further change the flow regime of the rivers, change the inundation patterns in the Inner Niger Delta, as well as the ecosystem services and the livelihoods, and that may further increase the tensions between those groups. So that is the situation that we are looking into together with stakeholders, and we discussed with a group of stakeholders last year, or maybe the year before, I'm not sure. What would be the options for those different groups in the Inner Niger Delta if they lose this basis for their livelihoods? And what we learned, that if the wetland flooding regime changes, the current livelihood opportunities would be further under stress. And what the stakeholders told us is that there are only very few alternative options for those people, because there aren't many livelihood opportunities that are not dependent on ecosystem services. So what people do is they diversify their income, but it means that farmers would also have more cattle, or pastoralists would also go fishing. So that may actually increase the tensions what is also mentioned is that people blame the government for the worsening situation, and they feel more attracted to religious extremism as also an alternative form of government. And with the government withdrawing from the inner Niger Delta because of insecurity, that also opens up possibilities to engage in illegal activities in the area. And those people who feel uncomfortable in the insecure situation and lose their livelihood have also left the inner Niger Delta. So migration here is not the regular transhumance of the pastoralists, but people actually leaving the inner Niger Delta because they don't see a future for them. So these are some of the different options that people say, if they can't continue doing what they always did, this is what people may do. But whether people will also do, so that may give a motivation, but whether people also do it also depends on their ability to do so. So if it's easy to get small firearms, it may be also easier to join illegal activities. If there's no rule of law, it's easier to join illegal activities. But of course, if we understand how these, how this behavior and these choices and human responses work, it also helps us to identify possible actions to influence that behavior. And these type of actions can be related to water management. So we can think of not building the dam upstream or operating the dam in a different way. Or we can make it more easy for the local communities to engage in alternative activity, maybe through providing access to finance or to train them into other skills. Or there could be very different type of solutions. For example, some of the conflicts are because people move with their cattle over irrigated land that was previously pasture, so they always went there, but it's now farmland. So if there could be like institutional arrangement to agree on who uses the land when and when can farmers pass, maybe that also helps to solve conflict without changing the land use, just to agree on a better joint use of the land. But these are just some of the options. The main point I want to make is, if together with the stakeholders we get a more in-depth understanding of how the responses of the people to changes in their environment work in combination with all kinds of other factors that are in play, influence from jihadists moving to Mali, institutional changes, etc. If we understand that better, it helps us to think about where can this system be influenced, what type of options may be the most effective. And like I said, once we understand this system in a qualitative way, we also like to see if we can find quantitative information to further justify it or to better indicate the magnitude of the influence of different factors. So what plays the largest role? Is it really climate change impacting the inundation patterns, or is it the dam? So here some analysis with quantitative information is useful, so everybody gets a better understanding of what is really going on. So we do this partly with global data that are directly available within the WPS Global tool or through other sources. We can model the water system in more detail to analyze the impacts of dams or expansion of irrigation systems and see how that changes the flow regime. And we are analyzing also the human behavior in a quantitative way to look into, at an individual level, what triggers a certain response, what are the options that people have, and what are the factors that make that people choose one option and not another. And then with this information, we feed the joint water security analysis that I mentioned in the beginning. So we propose this alternation between engagement with actors and analysis. So for example, we start with a meeting where we identify what information needs are and how people perceive the water insecurity linkages and what questions they actually have on how water and security are linked or what other factors influence it. And then we will collect information. Then we will have another meeting to verify with this group of people whether this understanding and what the quantitative information tells us. And then we can move on to identify possible solutions, of which we can then assess their effectiveness. And then again, we join with the group to discuss if this is the effectiveness of individual options. What do you think should give priority, or who can actually take what action, and what are the conditions for implementation? And that, of course, may raise a demand for further research, may identify other knowledge gaps. So I think what is important is that there is a longer term process in which we collect information based on questions and work with a group of stakeholders from different sectors so that they get a better understanding of how everything is linked and what could be done. And we make the results from the analysis available through different tools to make sure everyone has access to the same information. And it could be a website type description of the situation, as you see here, or a more interactive analysis tool in which you can click on different buttons and analyze for different locations and different scenarios how important factors, conflict risk or ecosystem service availability may change. So this is what I wanted to show to you about the work we're doing in Mali. And just to finalize what we are working on, and we are developing it as we are applying it in different regions. So it's changing continuously, but we're working on an integrated, inclusive and informed approach to address water-related security risks, with which our main aim is to support discussions among actors with dedicated data collection and analysis over a longer period of time, so that hopefully we can contribute to develop a shared understanding of how to influence water-related security risks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen, for showing what analysis and data can do, especially if they're actually meant to support processes that different stakeholders engage in order to prevent or mitigate conflict. So not being done for the sake of research or of understanding in general, but really meant to feed into existing processes. And that, I think, exactly brings us back to the key question of this session, is how can we make sure that the analysis that can be provided to decision makers is actually useful to them, but also, looking from the other perspective, how can we make sure that decision makers also make use of such data and such information in order to come to more informed decision-making processes? I have two questions on that for Chris and Ika. Let me start with Chris. You've touched on that a little bit earlier already, but if I was to ask you, what do you think are the 2 or 3 key gaps that we still have in our knowledge about water, climate, and security that need to be filled, or that you would wish people doing analysis, developing tools would look at? What would these be? If it's 1 or 4, that's also fine.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, I think that you know, I find that actually more and more now there's actually quite a plethora of information and data available, and I think that often you know, organizations and companies can sort of try to solve some of the issues, or try to provide a lot of data and information through geo and GIS mapping. And so what I find is that often, you know, that what the missing bit is really the sort of really in-depth working at the community level and using community knowledge. And I think that's the big gap here, is we know, and we've got huge amounts of satellite data. I've got maps, you know, online of so many things, specifically from GIS satellite imagery. And I'm not saying that they're not useful. I think it's really good, but part of the issue is that there is so much available out there, and it is the analysis of that is great. And I think that there's trying to bridge. So I guess the first point is trying to bridge that gap between science and information to very concrete recommendations that are locally important and locally can be locally used as well, and really understanding those local situations. Because I think it's easier to sit behind a desk and see the geospatial mapping and everything, but to understand like the community dynamics and the conflicts behind those dynamics. And we must understand that conflict is multifaceted. It's not, you know, that we can see that the access, competition of natural resources like water, or the impacts of flooding to climate displaced populations, we can see that from a satellite imagery, but to understand those dynamics from the community level is really key. So I think that trying to bridge that gap is quite important. I think the second point, as my colleague was saying, Ikal, around how do we link that to nature-based solutions and thinking about the ecosystems. And I think that again, from knowledge and information, we can gather a lot. But how do we really understand those ecosystems thinking? And we can provide knowledge and information and some sort of policy recommendations, but unless we understand the ecosystem around those conflicts, we're not going to actually find a solution there. So there's growing evidence now of the importance of nature-based solutions, but those nature-based solutions have to be locally led and at the local level. So, for example, things like we're looking at things like vegetative gabion walls and those sort of things at the breakage point, and planting the right type of trees or managing the floodplains. And so but we can sort of suggest that from the satellite imagery, but it's got to be at the local level where we really understand what type of tree, what type of fast growing roots, how does that community work with that dynamic? And then I think that it's really got to be, you've got to match that top level. And I'm not at all saying that it's not important. I think it's really, really important to have it. But how do you match that to that, with the local level? And also the indigenous knowledge, with this, knowledge is being lost now. And we really have to gather that and use that and bring that together. So yeah, those are the points.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Important points indeed. Moving on to Ikal, I'd be curious from your perspective and the work that you've been doing, to what extent is it information gaps or lack of knowing what to do that prevents action, and to what extent is it any other factor, and then which ones, and how can more knowledge and more information, especially that gathered in cooperation in a participatory process with local stakeholders, how can that help overcome these impediments?
Sorry, I've had to put my video off. It started to play tricks on me. So yeah, so yeah, I like what Chris is saying. I'm, no pun intended, I'm wondering if he really works for the UN, but yeah, no pun intended there. So key things, I think, we focus so much on water security. It's like we sometimes silo the idea of water in itself, but it doesn't operate in a vacuum. I think that's very critical, that water itself is as much a resource like gold and other things that people fight for control, ownership, and cost. It really, that the power that water gives persons, entities, communities is very critical to think about. So one of the things I think about when you asked that question and when Chris was talking was the fact that there's certain things, water, plants, everyday nature itself is something that people interact with differently across the globe. And so how people interact with it is a very critical part of the knowledge that we bring on the table. It is sad that most of the research that comes out, if you look at any research paper on water or conflict, it has an expert in it. And we just forget that it is something that people interact with every day. So once we bring in the human-centered approach to the way we look at and we understand data is something that I think is a gap. We see data, it's sort of like it's that thing out there, but we've got to sort of internalize it and bring that human-centered approach to how we analyze the data. That's the first thing. I'm doing outdoor ethnography, so I put myself in most of my research. I think the other thing, and I saw one of the questions there when someone was saying about political, I think the political economy analysis to the way the ecosystems that we work in. So sometimes we sort of come in and say it's communities, it's, and actually the multifaceted, aspects of conflict means that there is a lack to really look at the political economy analysis. Who's controlling this? What are the drivers of conflict that are not what we see? The nuances that we sometimes miss out when we are looking at water as that resource that is supposed to be for common good, but recognizing that there is actually a control aspect to it. There's a cost aspect to it. There's a political aspect to it. And there's an economic aspect to it. So I think those are the big gaps that are missing. But also, even as we look at this indigenous knowledge, and that's why I said I like what Chris was talking about, is really looking at what that environment that we are looking at, you know, the trees that are planted. And sometimes we say, let's just plant trees, but not recognizing that some trees that we are asking to be planted, you know, take up a lot more water. Some crops that we are asking to be planted address food security, but actually abstract more water, and means that creates conflict with another person. So just really looking at and listening to. And so I think one of the things that more water researchers should do, and more research teams should do, is bring in anthropologists, bring in cultural people who understand that, you know, that the people side to this, because they would bring in that human centered, the cultural side to this conversation. So I think that for me, those are the key things that we need to bring on board.
Thanks, Ikal. I think this is indeed an important point, and one that is quite often neglected in work that's being done. So definitely also a key message of today's session, to take a broader and much more interdisciplinary look at things. There are quite a few questions coming in the chat and in the Q&A that relate to Karen's input. So I'd just like to bundle them up into one question for you, Karen. It all revolves somehow around these processes of working with local stakeholders, with local decision makers, with local policy makers, around developing solutions, or at least identifying possible solutions. Can you elaborate a little bit on what the challenges are? I think we've heard quite a bit about the benefits already. So what are the challenges that we've been facing? And also maybe a little side question, can that also be used when it comes to infrastructure planning, these tools?
Yes. Yeah, I saw indeed some questions on the tools and the data, but what we're trying to do is to really start from how the people that we think could benefit from information, how they perceive the questions and the information needs that they have, if any. So really to understand exactly, I think also, well, I don't know exactly if it's what Ikal mentioned, but I think we're trying to take this human-centered approach, and why do people show a certain behavior that is violent? There is conflict. How does that link to resources, or to other factors? And only when we understand how that works qualitatively, we see, are there maybe some questions around it, and then we collect data and other information. So that also means that the specific information that is in the tool for Mali will differ from the information that will be in the tool for Niger or for Chad or for Iraq. So I think the approach can be applied to any issue, but it requires, and maybe that is a challenge, that you get the people who are affected and the people who are able to do something about it at the table. And I can imagine, in principle, it's something you can do at a national level or at a community level, but of course in insecure contexts, it may be difficult to do something at the local community level, and maybe not all the parties in a conflict are willing to sit around the same table. So I can imagine it would have to be adjusted, but in principle, a qualitative discussion of what are the key issues, what are causes, and what are the consequences of these changes. I think that is something that is, in principle, the methods may need to be adjusted, but in principle suitable to any context. And I think it's really important to do something like that and not too quickly to move to discussing possible solutions, because people may also propose solutions for the wrong reasons. So I think if we understand how the system works, how people respond to changes, then you can think about what will possible solutions do to this system. And that is also, I think, a way of connecting the national and the community level, because it may also, in Mali, we have not so far proposed to have all those groups together in one meeting, but we have similar but separate processes at the national level and at the community level. And we use the insights from the community level will feed into the discussion at the national level, and the national analysis at the river basin level can provide the context for the discussions at the local level. So I don't know if I answered to all the questions, but this is how I see that, how we try to work.
Thanks, Karen. And I think with the last part of your answer, you actually alluded to another important point that I would maybe quickly like to get Chris and Ikal's thoughts on, very quickly though, given how time is progressing. Is it maybe the case from your perspective that in addition to maybe a lack of information or a lack of solutions to address these water and climate conflict risks, it's also the fact that at different governance levels, these topics might just drop off the agenda. So there might be something that's very pressing at the local level and being acknowledged at the local level, but totally drops off the national agenda and therefore doesn't get enough attention and not enough policy leverage or maybe also financial means to actually be addressed. Not even talking about, but maybe Chris, you can talk about the global level and the rather short attention span there. Do you think that's an issue? And can you maybe elaborate, Chris, for the global and Ikal for the more local level, what can be done to ensure that this remains on the agenda and people act on it? Chris, do you want to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I agree with you. I think that the problem here is breadth versus width, or depth versus width. And I think that that's always going to be a problem with these things, is that if you're trying to go too broad and try to get everybody included and trying to go top level and community level and humanitarian and development and trying to do it everything all at once, you're going to lose interest and focus. And so there has to be some sort of middle ground, and that's where we've got to head to. And so I think that two things. I think one is that the interest of policy level won't be ignored as climate change gets worse and worse and worse, because the impacts of climate change will continue to increase, and so populations and people will increase massively. And if we look at, there are several articles in the Times and CBS and reports on the fall of the Taliban and the aspect of how climate change has made communities more vulnerable. And actually, what the interesting learning from that, and this is just my perspective on this, but there's no scientific evidence of this. But the thing is if we focus too much on strengthening the system and the central level on issues of, governance, policies, protection, and corruption, we're going to lose focus on the community level. And then, therefore, militant groups can take over and they can take much more control because there's no resources. There's lack of alternatives. So, but then at the same time, if we don't focus enough at the central level and we don't focus on corruption, policy building, and systems building, we're going to lose focus at the top level. So I think it has to be a middle ground. And unfortunately, it's not the great answer, because it doesn't give you a clear set of approaches. But I think I do think we need to prioritize in the middle ground. We need to say, let's focus both at the local and at the political level, and try not to be pulled into all the political issues, but try not to be too pulled into the local level ideas as well. So it has to be somewhere in the middle.
Thanks, Chris. Ikal, what are your thoughts on prioritizing action on that?
I agree with the need for middle ground, but I think unless we actually appreciate that when we talk about sustainable development, it's got to be sustainable for all. So and if we go and if we talk about development, it's got to be, the big question is development for whom and with whom. So if it's not development with the people around who these conflicts are happening, who are being impacted by a climate crisis, who are being impacted by extreme abstraction for industry and others, then we will not be addressing the root cause, which is really built around development with them, And so we'll keep saying it's going to look like a climate conflict, but it is going to be human-driven conflict through just our own inaction or taking a shortcut. So as much as we should be working for a middle ground to at least get the low-hanging fruits and try and build more interest and leverage on that, we've got to be very careful that doesn't become the normal, that looking for sort of middle ground that it ends up excluding others then becomes the norm, because it becomes sort of, that's what's sustainable. And so then we've got to then ask the questions, what is that sustainability we're looking for? And sustainability can only be built by ownership of these processes by the people.
Thanks, Ikal. I think that's an excellent point, and also is reflected in the discussions that we're recently seeing around equity in the SDGs, and whether we can actually ensure not only that the different SDGs support each other instead of negatively affecting each other, but also how can we make sure that equity is, well, I guess not maintained, but built in the first place when it comes to the different SDGs. So yeah, another key important message, I think, of this session. As we're coming to a close, and I know that the organizers will be very strict on us closing in time, I would like to take the opportunity to ask each of our speakers one last question, same question for all of the three of you, asking for a very, very short answer on that. What would be your three either lessons learned or wishes for the future if we want to ensure that all the knowledge that we actually seem to be having on the link between water and climate on the one and security on the other hand, into action that really makes a difference, as you were just saying, Ikal, especially for those that are the most affected by conflict. And maybe I let Karen go first this time, and then give Chris and Ikal a little more moment to think. Karen.
Thanks. It gave me very little time to reflect on this. I don't have three lessons. What I really hope is that it will be more common to do a joint analysis with those involved at a community level or at a national authority level. That doesn't matter, ideally both, and get it connected. Because I think no matter how much we like to do research and generate and collect data, it's a complete waste of effort if we do not create a demand for information or an understanding of what's based on the understanding of what's happening. From there should come the demand for additional information and not the other way around. So that is what I'm hoping will be a more commonly adopted approach. Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe Chris next.
Yeah, no, I mean, I thought the sort of main three takeaways would be, local level ownership and engagement. And I totally agree with Ikal's comment about equity and the fact that, until we've got that, we really are not anywhere with this. And I think, locally led adaptation and supporting that is key. I think the second sort of point is around, there has to be a coordinated approach, and it needs to be multi-leveled. And it needs to be multilateral. I think that we can't do this in silos. We need to do this together. It's a huge task. I think that's the sort of second point. And the sort of third one is really, I think data and evidence at that local level is key. But I think then sort of bringing that mix in with international and data approaches, I think a mixed approach has to be done. So that's my third point. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. And Ikal, you have the last word on this question.
So as Karen said, research, I think my wish list is that if research can be broken so that citizens can understand, so that so the tools that they can use to demand from their leaders, because sometimes we do this with the policy makers, but the citizens don't know how to use it. So to create that demand aspect, I think investments in long term. So it's not in short, it's looking at the short term, but looking at that long term ecosystem angle. For me, those would be the two main things. And eventually it's equity, equity for all. So how do we start to look at, there's not much more water. So how do we start to look at use, conservation, reuse, recharge as part of the bigger picture around water, equity and conflict?
Thanks so much for that. I think that slowly brings us to the close of the session. I will not attempt to actually summarize it, but I would like to highlight a few points. I think it has become clear that only if we bring the data and the analysis that is available in close connection, or actually in interaction with those that take decisions and that decide not only about maybe addressing water conflicts or preventing or mitigating water conflicts, but ideally also those that make decisions of how to develop water resources or energy or food or whatever in the future that could have repercussions on conflict dynamics, then we'll achieve, hopefully, better, more cooperation, less conflict, and more sustainable development. And we've discussed a little bit how that is possible, what type of data would be needed, how these processes can look like. But I think very importantly, We've also touched on topics that we hadn't really planned for the session, but that I think are critically important. And thanks especially Ikal, but also Karen and Chris for bringing those in. Questions around equity, questions around anthropology, bringing in the specific local context, which of course, on the one hand, makes everything even more complicated, as if things weren't complicated enough yet. But I think is also the only way ahead if we want to really address the conflict potential that lies in water risks and in climate risks. So I think that is really, at least for me, one of the key takeaway messages of that session. We have not managed to respond to all of the questions that we received in the Q&A and in the chat box, but I would like to encourage everyone to check out the website of the Water, Peace and Security Partnership, which very simply is waterpeacesecurity.org, where you can find more information on the work that we do, the global forecasting tool that we have, but also the local work that we do in a number of regions. And I would like to invite you to get in touch with us or with any of the speakers. I've seen quite some exchange in the chat already going back and forth on specific topics, so that we just keep this discussion going and take it forward, all of us together, of this session here today. Last but not least, I would like to thank, of course, our three speakers, Ikal, Karen, and Chris, but I also like to thank my colleagues from the Water, Peace and Security Partnership who supported this, and of course, Adelphi, the host of the Berlin Climate and Security Conference. And with that, we're finishing even a few minutes earlier. That might be the German punctuality in me, but thanks everyone for joining. I think it was a great session, and I really look forward to continuing the discussion with all of you very soon. Thank you very much, and goodbye to everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.